"Sir, those front rows are reserved for people who actually belong there." The event coordinator did not raise her voice, but she did not need to. Her words drifted across the Grand Civic Auditorium just loudly enough for nearby guests to turn and look. Conversation slowed. A few smiles appeared. Others simply watched in silence. Nathan Brooks looked at the laminated seating card in his hand, then back at the woman standing in front of him. Melissa Carter wore a navy blazer with the city's event badge clipped neatly to her lapel. Everything about her appearance suggested professionalism. Everything about her assumptions suggested something else. Nathan smiled politely. "I understand," he replied. "Where would you like me to sit?" Melissa pointed toward the final rows near the back entrance. "There are plenty of open seats back there." She reached for the seating card without waiting for permission, glanced at it for barely a second, then handed it back as though it held no importance at all. "Those sections will be more appropriate." Nathan thanked her with a simple nod and quietly walked toward the rear of the auditorium. He carried no expensive briefcase, wore no luxury watch, and had arrived without assistants, photographers, or security. His charcoal jacket fit comfortably over an open-collar white shirt, and his polished brown shoes reflected the warm lights hanging above the stage. To nearly everyone in the room, he looked like another guest who had wandered into an event far more important than himself. That illusion suited him perfectly. The annual City Forward Leadership Gala attracted business owners, nonprofit organizations, teachers, veterans, first responders, and community volunteers from across the region. Banners celebrating neighborhood renewal projects stretched across the stage while a string quartet played softly near the entrance. Waiters carried trays of sparkling water and appetizers through the growing crowd as television crews adjusted cameras for the mayor's keynote address. Nathan watched the room with quiet appreciation. He recognized volunteers helping elderly guests find their seats. He noticed high school students proudly wearing scholarship medals around their necks. He smiled as children from the City Youth Orchestra rehearsed one last piece before the ceremony began. These were the moments he cared about most. Buildings eventually aged. Investments rose and fell. But communities grew stronger every time ordinary people chose to serve one another. Near the center aisle, Thomas Reynolds adjusted his tuxedo while greeting several corporate sponsors by name. He caught a brief glimpse of Nathan walking toward the back rows and leaned toward another guest with a quiet chuckle. "Looks like somebody wandered into the wrong section." The guest offered an uneasy smile but said nothing. Nathan heard the remark without slowing his pace. Years of experience had taught him that assumptions often revealed more about the speaker than the person being judged. He reached an empty chair near the back wall, folded his event program carefully, and sat down with the same calm expression he had worn from the moment he entered the building. Across the auditorium, city staff hurried between tables making final adjustments before the mayor arrived. Melissa continued welcoming well-dressed donors, escorting several of them personally to the front rows with warm smiles and enthusiastic handshakes. She never looked toward Nathan again. From where he sat, the stage appeared smaller, but the people remained exactly the same. Nathan rested his hands comfortably in his lap and quietly observed the room filling with expectation. He had attended enough public ceremonies to know that the most revealing moments almost never happened under the spotlight. They happened long before anyone stepped onto the stage. Nathan Brooks remained in the last row as more guests entered the auditorium, each arrival adding another layer of energy to the evening. Volunteers welcomed community leaders by name while photographers captured smiling handshakes beneath banners celebrating new neighborhood projects. Every few minutes another distinguished guest was escorted toward the reserved front section with warm greetings and genuine enthusiasm. Nathan watched the scene unfold with quiet appreciation rather than disappointment. He had attended enough public events to understand that first impressions often arrived long before first conversations. A young violin ensemble began performing near the stage, filling the auditorium with gentle music that softened the growing excitement in the room. Nathan closed the event program resting in his hands and allowed himself a small smile. Music had always reminded him why he invested in communities instead of simply investing in businesses. Numbers could measure profits, but they could never measure the confidence a child gained from standing on a stage for the first time or the hope a neighborhood discovered after seeing someone believe in its future. Years earlier, after building his company from a single rented office into one of the nation's leading community development organizations, financial advisors encouraged him to focus only on projects with the highest returns. Nathan had politely declined every recommendation. Instead, he directed millions of dollars toward public libraries, youth leadership centers, scholarship funds, neighborhood parks, and workforce training programs. Most of those projects carried the names of local teachers, firefighters, veterans, or volunteers rather than his own because he believed recognition belonged to the people serving their communities every day. His greatest satisfaction came from quietly watching others succeed without ever knowing who had helped create the opportunity. Across the auditorium, Thomas Reynolds continued greeting prominent business executives while discussing upcoming redevelopment initiatives. He glanced toward Nathan once more before casually remarking to another sponsor, "I suppose everyone likes to feel important for one evening." The comment drew a few polite laughs before the conversation moved on. Nathan heard the words but kept his attention on the youth orchestra finishing its final rehearsal. Experience had taught him that responding to every assumption only gave those assumptions more importance than they deserved. At the opposite side of the auditorium, Melissa Carter checked guest lists, adjusted reserved seating cards, and welcomed newly arriving officials with practiced confidence. She walked past Nathan twice while directing other attendees toward the front rows but never once considered asking whether he needed anything. To her, he appeared entirely ordinary, and that single assumption shaped every interaction. Nathan simply thanked another volunteer who offered him a bottle of water before returning to watch the stage preparations. Behind the curtains, technicians tested microphones while city employees reviewed the evening schedule one final time. The mayor's arrival was expected within minutes, and anticipation steadily spread through the audience. Nathan folded his hands comfortably and looked around the auditorium once again. He admired the retired teachers sitting together near the center aisle, the young entrepreneurs excitedly exchanging ideas, and the nonprofit volunteers proudly wearing badges representing neighborhoods across the city. They reminded him why gatherings like this mattered. Communities were never transformed by buildings alone. They were transformed by people willing to believe in one another before expecting anything in return. As the lights gradually dimmed and the master of ceremonies prepared to begin the program, Nathan remained exactly where he had been asked to sit, calm, patient, and completely unaware to everyone around him, while somewhere beyond the backstage entrance a message had just reached City Hall that would soon change the direction of the entire evening. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone to the annual City Forward Leadership Gala, and the audience responded with warm applause as the opening program officially began. Community volunteers were recognized first, followed by local educators, neighborhood organizations, and small business owners whose efforts had strengthened the city throughout the past year. Nathan Brooks listened attentively from the last row, applauding every recipient with genuine appreciation. Recognition had never been the reason he invested in communities. Watching dedicated people receive well-deserved gratitude was rewarding enough. Around him, conversations continued quietly between guests seated in the reserved section near the stage. Thomas Reynolds leaned comfortably toward two fellow sponsors and nodded toward the back of the auditorium. "Interesting crowd tonight," he remarked with a faint smile. "I suppose anyone can register for these events now." One guest chuckled politely while another simply glanced over his shoulder before returning his attention to the stage. Nathan heard the comment but showed no reaction. His eyes remained fixed on a group of high school students preparing to present scholarships they had earned through months of volunteer service. Their excitement reminded him of his own early years when opportunities depended on whether someone believed in potential before seeing accomplishments. Melissa Carter continued moving efficiently through the aisles, checking seating assignments and assisting newly arriving guests. Each time an elected official, prominent donor, or corporate executive entered the auditorium, she greeted them warmly and personally escorted them toward the front. Twice she passed Nathan without acknowledging him, assuming he was simply another attendee content to remain unnoticed. Her attention stayed focused on those she believed belonged in the spotlight. Nathan accepted the oversight with the same quiet patience he had carried since arriving. Years of experience had taught him that dignity never depended on another person's invitation. Near one of the side entrances, Officer Julia Martinez stood monitoring the event while greeting visitors with a professional smile. As she scanned the audience, her attention suddenly settled on the gentleman seated near the back wall. She looked again, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. 2 years earlier she had attended the opening of a youth leadership center that transformed an abandoned recreation building into a vibrant community space for hundreds of local teenagers. The project had been made possible through a generous private partnership led by Nathan Brooks. Unlike many executives who arrived only for photographs, Nathan had spent nearly the entire afternoon talking with students, volunteers, and neighborhood families. Julia remembered that kindness immediately. She quietly walked a few steps toward the last row, intending to greet him with respect. Before she reached him, Nathan looked up and recognized her. Their eyes met for only a moment. He smiled warmly, then gave the smallest shake of his head. It was not a dismissal. It was a gentle request to let the evening continue naturally. Julia understood at once. She returned the smile and remained where she was, though a growing sense of concern stayed with her. She realized that almost everyone surrounding Nathan had formed opinions without asking a single question. On stage, the Master of Ceremonies announced that the mayor would soon arrive to present the city's highest civic leadership recognition. Excitement spread across the auditorium as photographers moved closer to the stage and television crews adjusted their cameras. Melissa made one final inspection of the reserved front rows while Thomas straightened his tuxedo, expecting an evening filled with familiar speeches and predictable honors. Nathan remained quietly seated in the back, unnoticed by nearly everyone in the room, while only Julia knew that the most respected guest of the evening had already been sitting among them from the very beginning. The evening continued with polished speeches celebrating civic pride, neighborhood partnerships, and the promise of a stronger future. Every few minutes another award recipient crossed the stage while photographers captured smiling handshakes beneath the bright lights. Nathan Brooks remained quietly seated in the final row, applauding every volunteer, every teacher, and every community organizer with the same sincere respect. He never looked impatient. He never checked the time. To him, the people being honored represented the very reason he had dedicated his career to rebuilding neighborhoods instead of simply expanding corporations. Across the auditorium, Officer Julia Martinez found it increasingly difficult to ignore what she was witnessing. She remembered standing outside the newly opened Youth Leadership Center on a rainy Saturday afternoon when Nathan had personally thanked every construction worker before speaking to the press. He had insisted that the cameras record the volunteers instead of himself. That simple decision had earned Julia's respect long before she ever learned the size of his company. Looking toward the last row now, she found it remarkable that nearly everyone around her saw only an ordinary guest while she recognized one of the most generous civic leaders in the state. She considered walking over again, but when Nathan briefly glanced in her direction, his calm expression carried the same quiet request as before. Let the evening unfold on its own. Julia nodded almost imperceptibly and remained at her post. She understood that dignity never demanded immediate recognition. Near the front of the auditorium, Melissa Carter continued escorting elected officials and prominent donors toward their reserved seats. She smiled warmly, offered bottled water, and thanked each guest for supporting the city. Passing the back section once again, she noticed Nathan sitting alone and paused only long enough to say, "Everything is fine back here, correct?" Before he could answer, another arriving executive called her name, and she hurried away without waiting for a response. Nathan simply smiled to himself. Sometimes people asked questions only because they expected quick confirmation rather than genuine conversation. A few rows ahead, Thomas Reynolds leaned toward another sponsor as the Master of Ceremonies announced that the mayor's arrival had been slightly delayed. "Hopefully our guest of honor has not forgotten us," Thomas joked confidently. After all, people in leadership know how important appearances are. Several guests nodded in agreement while others laughed politely. Nathan quietly folded the event program once more and rested it on his lap. Those words reminded him of advice his mother had shared many years earlier after they had once been overlooked at a neighborhood fundraiser because of the clothes they wore. She had gently squeezed his hand and whispered, "Never confuse being noticed with being valuable." That sentence had guided him through every stage of his life. It reminded him that respect earned through character always lasted longer than attention gained through status. On stage, the master of ceremonies received a small note from one of the event assistants and paused for only a moment before continuing. Behind the curtain, city staff exchanged brief, uncertain glances as several phones began quietly vibrating at the same time. Something unexpected had changed. Beyond the backstage entrance, a black sedan had just arrived outside the Civic Center. Mayor Daniel Harper stepped out, greeted several city officials, and immediately asked one question before entering the building. "Has Mr. Nathan Brooks already arrived?" The expressions around him shifted instantly. Without waiting for an answer, the mayor adjusted his jacket and walked briskly toward the auditorium doors, completely unaware that the man he was searching for had been patiently sitting in the back of the room since the very beginning of the evening. Mayor Daniel Harper entered the Civic Auditorium through the side entrance with the confidence of someone accustomed to public ceremonies, but the first question he asked immediately caught everyone nearby off guard. "Has Mr. Nathan Brooks arrived yet?" Several city staff members exchanged uncertain glances before one volunteer quietly admitted that they had not personally greeted him. The mayor's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "He always arrives early," he replied. "Please tell me he is not standing outside." Without waiting for another answer, he continued toward the backstage area where the master of ceremonies briefly paused the program to welcome him. The audience rose for polite applause as the mayor stepped onto the stage, shook hands with local officials, and thanked everyone for supporting another year of community progress. Nathan Brooks watched the scene unfold from the back row with the same calm attention he had maintained throughout the evening. He had attended countless public events over the years and understood that schedules rarely unfolded exactly as planned. Across the auditorium, Melissa Carter finally allowed herself to relax now that the mayor had arrived. She quietly congratulated another volunteer on keeping the evening organized before glancing once toward the back rows. Seeing Nathan still seated alone, she smiled faintly and whispered, "At least everyone found a place." Her comment carried no anger, only quiet certainty that everything was exactly as it should be. Nearby, Thomas Reynolds folded his hands comfortably and leaned toward another corporate sponsor. "I wonder who the mystery guest is tonight," he said with a confident grin. "Whoever receives the mayor's special recognition must have made quite an impression." His companion nodded in agreement before casually looking toward the reserved front seats that remained partially empty. Neither man considered the possibility that the person everyone expected to honor had been quietly watching the ceremony from the last row since it began. As the mayor continued thanking community leaders, neighborhood volunteers, educators, and local businesses, he unfolded a small note that had been handed to him moments earlier. He read it once, then looked across the audience instead of back at the speech prepared for him. His eyes slowly moved from one side of the auditorium to the other, searching carefully through every section. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several guests assumed he was simply acknowledging different organizations seated throughout the hall. Officer Julia Martinez immediately recognized the change in his expression. She knew exactly what he was looking for. Her eyes instinctively shifted toward Nathan, who remained peacefully seated with the event program resting on his lap. Julia felt a quiet sense of anticipation building inside her. She had witnessed enough official ceremonies to recognize when something unexpected was about to happen. Meanwhile, Nathan's thoughts briefly drifted back to another evening many years earlier when he had attended his first community fundraiser as a young entrepreneur. He remembered standing alone near the entrance while conversations continued around him without invitation. Driving home afterward, he had promised himself that if success ever found him, he would never measure another person's value by where they stood, what they wore, or who greeted them first. That promise had quietly shaped every decision he made for decades. Back on stage, Mayor Harper folded the note, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stepped away from the podium altogether. Instead of continuing his prepared remarks, he looked directly into the audience one more time before speaking in a calm voice that echoed throughout the auditorium. "Before we continue," he said, "there is someone in this room I need to personally thank." Conversation stopped instantly. Every eye turned toward the stage, completely unaware that within the next few moments the distance between the front row and the back row would no longer matter at all. Mayor Daniel Harper stepped away from the podium and allowed several seconds of complete silence to settle over the auditorium. Every conversation disappeared. Every camera turned toward the stage. Even the musicians sitting quietly near the side curtains lowered their instruments, sensing that the evening had unexpectedly changed direction. The mayor looked across the audience once more before speaking again. "The person I am looking for has spent years transforming neighborhoods, creating opportunities, and investing in people without asking for recognition in return." His voice carried naturally through the room. "I was informed that he arrived before I did, but I have not had the honor of greeting him yet." Curious whispers spread through the audience as guests glanced around the reserved front rows, expecting an important civic leader or well-known philanthropist to stand. No one moved. Thomas Reynolds adjusted his jacket and looked from table to table with growing confusion. Melissa Carter quietly reviewed her guest list once again, convinced someone important must have been delayed outside. Mayor Harper smiled politely before adding one more sentence. "Mr. Nathan Brooks, if you are here this evening, would you please stand?" Nathan slowly lifted his head from the final row near the back wall. Without any display of surprise, he calmly rose to his feet and offered the mayor a respectful nod. The entire auditorium instinctively turned toward the rear of the room. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Melissa followed the direction of everyone's attention until her eyes settled on the same gentleman she had personally asked to leave the front section earlier that evening. Her expression changed instantly. Thomas looked over his shoulder, disbelief replacing every assumption he had confidently repeated throughout the night. Officer Julia Martinez quietly smiled to herself. She had known this moment would eventually arrive. Mayor Harper immediately stepped down from the stage instead of asking Nathan to walk forward alone. He made his way through the center aisle at an unhurried pace, greeting no one else along the way. Guests instinctively moved their chairs aside to create space as he continued toward the last row. The distance between the stage and the back of the auditorium suddenly felt much shorter than before. When the mayor finally reached Nathan, he extended both hands with unmistakable warmth. "Mr. Brooks," he said sincerely, "I have been looking forward to thanking you all evening. I sincerely apologize that I did not greet you the moment you arrived." Nathan returned the handshake with the same quiet grace that had defined every moment of the evening. "There is no apology necessary, Mayor," he replied gently. "The community is the reason we are all here." The mayor smiled with genuine admiration before answering, "That is exactly why everyone here deserves to hear from you." Around them, cameras captured every second. Melissa remained completely still, replaying every interaction she had shared with Nathan since the doors opened. Thomas lowered his eyes, remembering each careless remark that had seemed harmless only minutes earlier. Several guests who had never noticed Nathan before now watched him with quiet respect, not because they suddenly recognized his success, but because they had witnessed the dignity with which he accepted every misunderstanding. Mayor Harper released Nathan's hand only long enough to gesture toward the stage. "Sir," he said warmly, "would you do this city the honor of joining me?" Nathan looked briefly around the auditorium before nodding once. Together they began walking side by side toward the front of the room. No applause interrupted the moment. The silence itself carried far greater meaning than celebration ever could, because every person watching understood that the most important seat in the auditorium had never been located in the front row at all. Nathan Brooks accepted the microphone with both hands and remained silent for several seconds before speaking. He looked first toward the volunteers seated near the front, then toward the teachers, firefighters, neighborhood organizers, and finally to the guests seated in the very last rows of the auditorium. A gentle smile crossed his face. "Thank you, Mayor Harper," he began quietly. I am deeply grateful for your kind words, but I hope everyone here will allow me to say something important before we continue this wonderful celebration. The auditorium remained completely still. Nathan continued in the same calm voice that had carried him through every challenge of his life. When I walked into this building tonight, I was not thinking about recognition. I was thinking about the young volunteers who gave up their Saturday mornings to clean neighborhood parks. I was thinking about teachers who stay after school because one more student needs encouragement. I was thinking about small business owners who keep believing in communities even when success is not guaranteed. Those are the people I came here to celebrate. He paused briefly before continuing. Many years ago, my mother and I attended a community fundraiser in another city. We were welcomed politely, but we were quietly guided away from the seats everyone believed belonged to important people. On the drive home, I asked her if it bothered her. She smiled and said something I have never forgotten. She told me, a person's value never changes because someone else fails to recognize it. Nathan looked across the audience once again. Several people lowered their eyes as they reflected on the words. That lesson shaped every decision I have made throughout my career. It reminded me that buildings are important, but people matter more. Investments are valuable, but trust is priceless. Titles may open doors, but character determines what happens after those doors open. He gently rested one hand on the podium as his voice remained steady and sincere. Tonight, I was reminded once again that assumptions are often made before conversations begin. The remarkable thing is that assumptions do not only affect the person being judged. They also limit the person making the judgment. Every time we decide who someone is before learning their story, we close the door to understanding someone who may have become a friend, a mentor, a neighbor, or a partner in building something meaningful together. Complete silence filled the auditorium. Nathan never looked toward Melissa. He never mentioned Thomas. He never referred to any conversation that had taken place before the ceremony. Instead, he continued speaking about the future. Communities become stronger when respect arrives before recognition. Imagine what could happen if every person entering this building tonight had been welcomed with the same kindness, regardless of where they sat, what they wore, or whether anyone recognized their name. That simple choice would make every neighborhood stronger than any project my company could ever build. Several volunteers quietly wiped away tears. Mayor Harper stood beside Nathan with his hands folded, listening as attentively as everyone else in the room. Nathan finished with one final thought that settled gently across the audience. The front row is never defined by reserved signs or special invitations. The front row belongs to every person who chooses to see the dignity in another human being before asking what they have accomplished. If we leave this room remembering only one lesson tonight, I hope it is this. Respect should never wait for recognition. Nathan stepped back from the microphone and lowered his head slightly in gratitude. Once again, the auditorium remained perfectly silent, not because people had nothing to say, but because every person present had begun measuring their own character against the quiet truth they had just heard. For several long seconds, no one in the auditorium moved. The silence carried a weight that no applause could interrupt. Then Officer Julia Martinez slowly began clapping. Her steady applause echoed through the room until Mayor Daniel Harper joined her with genuine admiration. Within moments, every volunteer, every teacher, every business owner, every city official, and every guest rose to their feet. The standing ovation spread from the front row to the very back, erasing the invisible distance that had divided the room only an hour earlier. Nathan Brooks simply smiled and placed one hand over his heart before stepping away from the microphone. He had not defended himself. He had not reminded anyone of his accomplishments. He had simply reminded everyone of their shared humanity. As the applause gradually softened, Mayor Harper shook Nathan's hand once more and quietly thanked him for giving the city something far more valuable than another speech. "You reminded all of us why leadership begins with character," the mayor said sincerely. Nathan nodded with quiet gratitude. "Communities grow strongest when every person feels seen before they feel judged," he replied. Nearby, Melissa Carter waited patiently until the crowd began dispersing before approaching Nathan with visible humility. Her voice was soft, and every word was sincere. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you a genuine apology. When you arrived tonight, I believed I understood where you belonged before I ever introduced myself. I was wrong, and I am truly sorry." Nathan offered the same warm smile he had shown throughout the evening. "Thank you for saying that," he answered gently. "The apology matters because it opens the door for something better tomorrow. The next person who walks through these doors deserves to be welcomed before they are evaluated." Melissa nodded quietly, knowing she would remember those words every time she greeted another guest. A few moments later Thomas Reynolds approached with equal humility. The confidence that had filled his earlier conversations had completely disappeared. "I spent the evening making assumptions instead of introductions," he admitted. "I wish I had simply walked over and shaken your hand." Nathan smiled kindly. "Fortunately, tomorrow always gives us another opportunity to choose differently." Around them, volunteers continued folding programs and stacking chairs while community members lingered in small groups discussing the evening. Many conversations were no longer centered on awards or recognition. Instead, people spoke about respect, kindness, and the quiet strength they had witnessed from a man who never once demanded attention. Mayor Harper gathered the event staff before everyone departed and shared one final message. "Beginning with our next civic event," he announced, "every guest will receive the same welcome regardless of title, appearance, or seating assignment. Respect will be the first tradition we protect." The staff responded with quiet agreement, understanding that a meaningful change had begun long before the ceremony officially ended. Nathan collected his event program from the chair where he had left it, thanked several volunteers by name, and walked toward the auditorium doors with the same calm pace he had maintained from the beginning of the evening. Outside, the city lights reflected across the sidewalks that so many people had worked together to improve. Nathan paused for only a moment before looking back at the building behind him. He smiled, not because he had finally stood on the stage, but because he hoped the next unfamiliar face entering those doors would never again be asked to earn the respect that should have been offered from the very beginning. The finest seat in any room is never reserved by a nameplate or a title. It is earned every day by the simple decision to honor the dignity of another person before knowing anything about their story.